In response to the unlawful killing of a young woman in unsuitable attire by morality police last week, thousands of women have taken to the streets of Iran in protest of regime-imposed hijab law. As he spoke at the 77th UN General Assembly in New York City yesterday, Iran's president, Saeed Ibrahim Raisi, negotiated nuclear deals and decried Western double standards, deflecting the criticism of world's leaders. He failed to mention much on the current state of his country, where the internet had been taken offline by authorities, women were burning their hijabs in the street, and 8 people died as a result of intensifying anti-regime protests. Over the past 6 days, waves of women's rights protests have spread rapidly across dozens of cities in Iran, as the women of the country have taken to the streets with anger and defiance to face off against the police, militia and strict hijab laws that oppress their freedom, in what has become the biggest challenge the regime has seen in years. Videos of public moral outrage and widespread dissent have swept across social media, with eyewitnesses and human rights groups saying authorities have cracked down hard on protesters, using tear gas, violence and internet blackouts to try and contain the demonstrations. The escalating unrest was ignited by the death of a young woman, Mahsa Amini, at the hands of the Iranian morality police, or Gasht-e-Irshad, last week, due to her unsuitable attire. At the entrance to a subway station in Tehran on Tuesday, Mahsa Amini was arrested by morality police for not wearing her hijab correctly, and was driven away in a police van where eyewitnesses say she was violently beaten up by authorities. Mahsa was 22 years old, and had traveled with her brother from their home in western Iran to visit family members in the capital city. Authorities initially told Amini's brother that she would be released after attending a briefing class. Instead, after collapsing at the detention center, she was admitted to Kasra Hospital and pronounced brain dead on arrival. Amini later died at the hospital on Friday, after spending 3 days in a coma. Authorities have denied accusations of violence against Ms. Amini, claiming she died due to sudden heart failure. Her family, however, have vehemently rebuked the police's statement, saying she was fit and healthy at the time of her arrest. Justice, liberty, no to mandatory hijab. Videos posted online of the unprecedented events unfolding across Iran have shown the magnitude of outrage felt by both Iranian men and women in response to Mahsa Amini's death. Undoubtedly catalyzed by the violence and injustice of the innocent young woman's mistreatment, the dissent in Iran reveals the deep-rooted anger of a nation that's endured decades of female oppression at the hands of a theocratic regime. Women of all ages have been at the forefront of clashes with the authorities during the protests, defiantly committing a range of outspoken acts and demonstrations punishable by Iranian law. One older woman was shown on social media to be shouting at the authorities, "If you think you are a man, come and kill me," whilst Tehran's university campus saw crowds of students chanting, "Killings after killings, to hell with morality police." There have also been widespread scenes of female liberty as women publicly remove and burn their headscarves on street bonfires, cutting their hair as crowds cheer them on chanting, "Death to the dictator," and "Life, Liberty and Women." Over the course of 6 intensifying days of protest, many police vehicles have been damaged and burned, with Islamic symbols and images of the 1979 revolution's founder, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, being torn down and destroyed. The authorities have responded to the protests with live ammunition, pellet guns and tear gas, says the UN. As one human rights group reported, at least 450 people have been injured and a further 500 arrested so far. The groups also reported that authorities opened direct fire on protesters, with 8 deaths so far, one of which involved a 16-year-old boy being shot in the head by police. Access to the internet and social media platforms was also restricted yesterday, in an attempt to curb the disruptions and prevent dissidents from instigating and orchestrating the protests online. The curbs have caused growing concern amongst activists, who liken the move to a similar blackout that preluded a massacre of more than 1,000 people during the nation's last widespread protests over fuel prices in 2019. Many have suggested the widespread unrest has been building for some time due to long-term oppression and economic hardship, boiling over last week after Ms. Amini's death and the recent hard lines President Raisi has drawn in implementing stricter hijab and chastity law last month. What are the hijab laws in Iran? Since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, an uprising that toppled the authoritarian monarchy in favor of an Islamic theocracy, women have been forced by law to wear proper clothing in public, involving a headscarf, hijab, and loose-fitting clothing to hide their hair and figures. According to government policy, if caught showing too much hair, wearing excessive makeup, or if the female body shape is revealed by short or close-fitting clothing, morality police officers have the authority to fine, imprison or subject, guilty, women to flogging. Enforcement of hijab law has been slack in recent decades, however, and it wasn't until the 2021 election of current President Raisi that the mandatory dress code for women was reinforced with a new list of further restrictions and punishments, signed into law on August 15 of this year. The government even plans to use facial recognition in public spaces to crack down on so-called women violators, infringing on the new hijab law by improper dress, as announced by Iran's headquarters for promoting virtue and preventing vice. The regime combines violent, old-fashioned forms of totalitarian control dressed up in new technologies, said Azadeh Akbari, a researcher in the Netherlands. What is likely to come from this? The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Nada al-Nashif, has expressed alarm at Mahsa Amini's death, condemning the moral police's escalating violence against Iranian women. She called for repeal of hijab law in the country, stating that the authorities must stop targeting, harassing, and detaining women who do not abide by the hijab rules. Mahsa Amini's tragic death and allegations of torture and ill treatment must be promptly, impartially and effectively investigated by an independent competent authority that ensures, in particular, that her family has access to justice and truth, said Nashif. The human rights chief also condemned the unnecessary or disproportionate use of force against protesters, appealing to Iranian officials to respect the right to peacefully exercise freedom of expression. The Iranian media and government officials have issued remarkably muted and underwhelming responses to Mahsa Amini's death and the escalating crisis unfolding in the streets. News stations have only reported one death so far, that of a police assistant who died as a result of injuries inflicted by violent protesters. Accusations have also been made by state TV about protests being fully organized with the agenda to create unrest, with Mahsa Amini's death being used as an excuse by Kurdish separatists to do so. President Raisi offered his personal condolences to Ms. Amini's father in a phone call, saying, "Your daughter is like my own daughter, and I feel that this incident happened to one of my loved ones," but then used his time on the podium at the UN General Assembly yesterday only to criticize the West's human rights and nuclear program double standards. In the years since the revolution, the women of Iran have slowly scaled up their opposition to regime-enforced subjugation of their freedom, with movements such as the Girls of Revolution Street and My Stealthy Freedom, purposely disobeying and publicly disregarding hijab law. Up until now, their voices have not been adequately heard by the international community, as less than 6 months ago Iran was elected by Western democracies to begin a 4-year term on the UN Women's Rights Commission that is exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women, a move which the executive director of UN Watch Hillel Neuer describes as like making an arsonist into the town fire chief. Support for the women of Iran has been shown from some world leaders during the proceedings of the UN General Assembly this week, with President Biden stating the U.S. will stand with the brave citizens and women in Iran who right now are demonstrating to secure their basic rights, and France's President Emmanuel Macron saying that the credibility of Iran is now at stake regarding the fact that they have to address this issue. The words of one female protester in Isfahan echoed the poignant desperation felt by the so-called second-class female population of Iran. "I hope the world supports us.